But Japan now sees itself as more necessary to advocate for the rules-based order as it comes under criticism by China, Russia, but also as the United States starts to challenge whether this post-war order is really the best way forward.
As tensions rise in the Indo-Pacific, Japan finds itself at a strategic crossroads. Facing growing threats from China and North Korea, Tokyo is shifting its foreign policy, aiming for greater autonomy and clearer strategic direction. It's an ambitious move to reshape global dynamics, build stronger economic ties, and reinforce a rules-based order. But uncertainty still surrounds America's long-term vision for the region and its commitment to Japan.
When Japan looks outwards, right, it's got friends in Southeast Asia, but it's now looking with a far more aggressive China. And it's also looking at a United States that's beginning to question its role and its credibility of the alliance, or the reliability of the alliances.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, against a backdrop of new trade talks in Washington, where President Trump has called recent negotiations with Japanese officials big progress, we explore how this critical U.S. Japan alliance is evolving and what Japan's new strategic ambitions mean for East Asia amid mounting geopolitical complexity. Today we're joined by Dr. Sheila Smith, John E. Merow Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. An expert on Japanese politics and foreign policy, Dr. Smith is the author of 3 books on Japan, including Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
There was a tweet from Donald Trump, and he is now meeting with a delegation from Japan, I believe. So I will let Sheila kind of set the stage with us in the very present moment before we expand that scope. So could you just tell us a little bit about what's happening as we speak right now?
Sure, happy to. Right now, our president is meeting with Minister Ryosei Akazawa, who is the fiscal and economic minister of the Ishiba cabinet, who has come here to Washington to directly negotiate with the president. Apparently, the Commerce and Treasury secretaries are also in the meeting. But this is, of course, going to be about the tariffs and how Japan can navigate the moment that we find ourselves in. So let me read the 618 this morning. I'm just going to read it to you quickly because it frames a little bit the perspective, I think, of the president on these negotiations with Japan. This is from Truth Social. Japan is coming in today to negotiate tariffs, the cost of military support, and quote unquote trade fairness, all in caps. I will attend the meeting along with Treasury and Commerce secretaries. Hopefully something can be worked out, which is good or great for Japan and the USA. The reason I wanted to read that is because we typically are looking at what's happening today between the United States and its partners, its trading partners, as an economic problem-solving exercise. However you come down on the Trump administration's approach, typically, we deal with trade and economic issues in one basket, and we deal with military and security issues in a separate basket. But I think the defining characteristic of this moment in the U.S.-Japan relationship, and in fact in the U.S. relationship with many of its allies, is that the president has decided to entwine the security relationship with Japan, our alliance with Japan, with our trade relationship. And of course, Japan has a trade deficit. We have a trade deficit with Japan, excuse me. But it is a lot lower than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago when the last Trump administration came into office. So I think, there's 2 pieces of the puzzle here. One is the strategy of this president towards Japan specifically, and by extension to our allies, but also the strategic context we find ourselves in the Indo-Pacific. And the reason that Japan is such a close ally is twofold. One, we have roughly 50,000 men and women in uniform stationed in Japan, forward deployed in that country. And we have the only aircraft carrier that is home ported outside of the United States is home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. So very important to the Seventh Fleet. very important to American military strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Our partnership with Japan goes way back, and we can talk about history if you'd like in the post-war period, but really that provision of bases and facilities for our forces and the support, both economic and material support that the Japanese government provides, allows our forces to operate the way they do across the Indo-Pacific. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is Japan today is our largest source of foreign direct investment in this country. So our trading relationship with Japan in the 1980s was quite acrimonious. As you know, there was a lot of trade wars, lots of very intense trade negotiations, an attempt. Japan was part of the GATT process, the global negotiation of the reduction of tariffs, but really where our trade negotiators, our STR special trade representatives ran into difficulty with Japan was in non-tariff barriers. So in the 1980s, you had a whole host of negotiations, U.S. Japan negotiations focused on reducing non-tariff barriers, institutional preferences, regulatory frameworks, all kinds of ways in which American goods didn't make their way to the Japanese consumer. That was the focal point of bilateral trade negotiations in the 1980s, and they were often very acrimonious. So our bilateral relationship has always dealt with force posture issues, i.e. which forces were going to be where, when, and how, including the burden sharing aspect of that, what the Japanese government would in fact pay for in terms of supporting our presence in Japan. And it's always had to do with trade. Now, some of you may remember the Plaza Agreement in the 1980s, which was really Ronald Reagan's way of saying, look, this alliance is so important. We don't want these trade disputes bubbling over all the time. So let's take a different tack. Let's look at monetary policy, and let's look also at the currency valuation. So the Plaza Agreement devalued the Japanese yen, made Japanese goods less competitive globally, but it also got rid of the specific frictions that we found with the trade imbalance with Japan. And those frictions, some of you may remember the 80s, had to do with congressional, members of Congress smashing Toshibas on the steps of the Capitol. That it was a very contentious issue. Our auto industry saw the Japanese auto industry as a particular competitor, right? So I think the Reagan administration decided that the alliance was important, that we needed a different way, a different avenue to solve this problem. And so the revaluation of the yen, the currency revaluation in the Plaza Agreement took away a lot of the bilateral irritants that were part of the trade talks of that period as well. Now, I will say, I don't want to go into all the details of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but I will say what's striking to me as I watch Donald Trump first in his coming into office campaigning for the first Trump administration, but also currently as he approaches our allies and this lever of tariffs, right, is the tone. If you close your eyes, I get transported back to the 1980s. And it's not just about Japan. It's about all of our trading partners, our alliances. I think the president comes to this conversation with two assumptions. One is America is best positioned to negotiate on trade and any other issue for that matter, if it's bilateral. And I think, was it Fotis who mentioned the multilateral context of NATO? The president prefers the bilateral talk, bilateral negotiating venue for much of this issue. The second is he still firmly believes that trade deficits are bad for America. And he is not convinced, which is the rhetoric or the theory of much of our policy of the post-war period, was the global economy was based on a relatively solid assumption of comparative advantage, right? We bought other people's goods because they made them better. The product cycle changed who made what better when in the time period, right? But we really believe that it wasn't a bad thing for American consumers to be buying Japanese cars, so long as American goods could get into the Japanese market and Japanese consumers also had a choice of what they wanted to buy. And so that logic, I think, is being challenged by President Trump and his approach. Many of you will have your own opinions on whether this is a good strategy or a bad strategy, so we don't need to go there. But for our allies, and I'm going to talk specifically about Tokyo, they have to cope with the new American administration, with their approach, and how they're going to negotiate with the United States given that approach. Now, Mr. Akazawa, who is here in Washington today, is in the hot seat quite clearly. He is very close to Prime Minister Shigeru. He has been picked over the Minister of Economic and Industry. He was selected by Ishiba specifically because he thought he had confidence in Akazawa's ability to navigate this. So we will find out, an hour or so from now on Truth Social or tomorrow morning in our newspapers. We will find out how those talks went. I don't expect that they will be finished, right? I think, one of the ways in which Prime Minister Ishiba has sought to begin the conversation with President Trump was in a summit meeting in February. And Prime Minister Ishiba came to President Trump and said, we want to buy from you significant amounts of American LNG gas, liquefied natural gas. We are happy to work also in building the infrastructure, investing in the infrastructure that would require, specifically from Alaska to Japan. There was a slight dissonance in the joint press conference after that meeting where the president said it was going to be a pipeline and the prime minister said it was going to be ships. So we don't know exactly what the plan is for the infrastructure side of that. But Japan and the Japanese prime minister came to Washington understanding that deficit reduction was a priority and that this was one way in which Japan was offering to change the trade balance. And it's a mutually beneficial outcome for both Japan and the United States. Japan needs LNG gas. They want diversified supply. The Biden administration, of course, had stopped those agreements, and Japan was very interested in resuming them. So that was the way in which the prime minister thought that the president seemed to be very happy with that. There was no mention whatsoever of the military relationship in that press conference. So that the entanglement that I suggested that you think about in the Truth Social post this morning between trade and the deficit and military support is a really important shift in the way, I think, in which the president is going to approach these negotiations. They will not stay in the lane of economic or trade policy. They are going to also suggest that the military alliance may also be called into question. Now, there's some odd reporting. There was a report last week. What day are we today? Towards the end of last week, that there was a cabinet gathering at which the president made some comment out of the blue about the U.S. Japan security arrangement being one-sided. And I can't remember which one of you asked me about the Constitution, but there you go. There's a little bit of linkage here. The U.S. Japan Security Treaty has 2 articles related to the security provisions. So Article 5 looks an awful lot like Article 5 of the NATO agreement. I don't know what the number is of the U.S. ROK Security Treaty, but same language, that the United States will assist Japan to deter aggression and, if necessary, to defend Japan in case of aggression against it. So that's a very common Article 5 promise of strategic protection or assistance from the United States. The second article is Article 6, in which the government of Japan offers to provide to the United States military facilities and bases. And this is to the original language of the treaty was designed to contribute to the stability of the Far East. So it's an older language than what we think of the Indo-Pacific today, but it is basically a commitment to allow forward deployed forces, not simply for Japanese defense, but for regional contingencies as well. So that's the bargain in the bilateral U.S. Japan Alliance, the strategic bargain. We get to maintain our forces forward deployed, and increasingly the Japanese government pays to support that presence, and the United States says we'll be there if you need us. Now, we can talk if you're interested about has Japan ever needed us, right? Has it been a defense moment, or has it always been deterrence? And the quick answer to that is largely always deterrence. But we are now in a slightly different strategic context where Japan is under threat more than it has been for much of the post-war era. And again, Courtney, we can go into that if you'd like as we talk about regional relations. Let me just finish on the last piece of the U.S. Japan, and that is, President Trump had a very close relationship with former Prime Minister Abe, who was assassinated several years ago. Prime Minister Abe was in power for 8 years. So Prime Minister Abe dealt with President Obama, President Trump. He had to pivot, as we may say, to very different approaches of the United States to its role, not only in the U.S. Japan Alliance, but also to the Indo-Pacific and globally. But I think what's interesting about Prime Minister Abe is he understood he had to meet the moment, so to speak, of a very different conversation about the value of alliances to the United States. And so he has basically set in motion, I think, what is currently a very similar Japanese approach. And that is to demonstrate that Japan is a partner to the United States, to demonstrate that it can mobilize to meet the sort of economic demands of President Trump to the best of its ability, of course. But what I worry about as we look forward, again, we'll know more tonight when the talks conclude, is this linkage between reciprocity and the military side of our relationship, in which, the president is pointing out, we only defend you, you don't defend us, which is true, right, for historical reasons that we can discuss. But the linkage of that with the trade deficit issue, I think, is going to be very difficult for Tokyo to deal with. So sorry, Courtney, that was a long intro, but that's where we are.
No, that was wonderful, Sheila. Thank you very much. I mean, I think we covered a lot on the U.S. front, and maybe we can return to that a little bit later. But so then kind of jumping off from there, I think Japan has had a very interesting role in the region and the world writ large. And it's evolving, I think, like all outlooks do. But how do you think Japan views its current strategic position in the world? So with all the rising tensions between great powers, with all this economic uncertainty, you could probably hear my dog squeaking now too, and evolving security threats. What are some of the key challenges and opportunities that you think Japan is looking at when it's shaping its current foreign policy?
So the region, so there's a lot there. I'll give you a couple of highlights, and then you can pursue what you and your colleagues, we can pursue what's ever of interest. Japan has always embedded its foreign policy in the region, pre-war and post-war. So pre-war with a very different approach, obviously, than post-war. But Japan very much sees itself as part of what we call today the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific in a previous decade or so. Japan has also seen its ties to Southeast Asia as particularly important to it. And that has, again, pre-war, post-war, but particularly post-war. Japan has very strong commercial ties with the nations of Southeast Asia. The Japanese government has also invested heavily in official development assistance or government aid. But so too have Japanese companies been very active in trade, foreign direct investment, other kinds of commercial enterprise. So Japan and Southeast Asia have been a fairly comfortable natural set. And so, Brian, when you said that Vietnam, that Japan is a particularly strong partner for Vietnam, the Japanese feel the same way about Vietnam. So I think this is an important place where the Japanese feel comfortable, both in their post-war ambition of being peaceful and not using their military power as part of the instruments of foreign policy, but also because there's an affinity, I think, there that goes beyond, geopolitics, right? It's a cultural affinity. And it seems to be very widely shared, right? Even for countries, even Singapore, which had a horrible relationship with Japan during the war, right? Has now a very robust trading relationship with the Japanese. So there's economic interest, there's cultural affinity, there's the sense for Japan that its place is in Asia. And that has always been part of the mix. I think what's happened in Northeast Asia, of course, you've got the more difficult relationships for Japan. So you've got South Korea, which normalized diplomatic ties with Japan in 1965. South Korea, of course, was colonized by Imperial Japan. So there is still the remnants of that particular history. And you see it in the bilateral relations, the ups and downs of political tensions between Seoul and Tokyo over time. China, Japan's invasion of China still looms in the background of that bilateral relationship. Japan normalized in 1978. Had been the largest supplier of overseas development assistance, again, official government aid, to the People's Republic of China after Deng Xiaoping initiated his market reforms. 25% or 30% at one time of official development assistance went to China from Japan, and commercial Japanese private sector investment, steel, other kinds of industrial manufacturing, huge private sector investment, some of it with great losses to China in the 1980s. Today, of course, Japan and China are not good friends in the sense of diplomatic ties, strategic challenges by China to Japanese territory, what the Japanese claim is their territory in these offshore islands, and coupled with the kind of warrior, the wolf warrior diplomacy. Japan, of course, in the war has resurfaced as something that the Chinese and Xi Jinping himself will emphasize as one part of their approach to Japan. And the Japanese don't feel so comfortable about that rendition of the China-Japan relationship. Of course, they feel like they've apologized. They've attempted to help China. They've done all they could to try to mitigate the legacy, the historical memory. But I think the Japanese public views of China are largely negative, especially the Chinese government, not necessarily the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist government. The Japanese people are not terribly excited about. Nonetheless, a large part of Japanese investment is in China. The China market is as appealing to Japanese manufacturers as it is to American and other manufacturers, right? This is a huge economic juggernaut, China. And so I think there's estimates by private sector research institutes of anywhere somewhere between 8 to 10% of the Japanese GDP relies on economic ties with China. So very important to the Japanese economy. I think beyond that, I think what you've seen in the last decade and a half or so is a Japan that has also sought to deepen its ties to Europe. Some of that stimulated by us, both as an ally and our other allies. During the first Trump administration, it was accelerated by what do we do about this new America that may or may not want to be engaged in the same way with the world or with our alliances, and certainly today. So the thing that's interesting to me, and I'll just put this as a highlight on the strategic side, is Japan is a NATO partner. Japan has deepened its commitment to NATO in support of NATO, not deliberate lethal combat assistance, but other kinds of programmatic assistance that run the gamut from defense technology innovation investment to mutual training. Italian Air Force goes to Hokkaido, for example, things like that. And also, two other pieces. Japan has now begun a very important military their next generation combat support fighter jet is being made by Japan, UK, and Italy. So now you've got actual weapons development, and obviously at the end, they're going to deploy this trilaterally. The Japanese have also invited the Europeans into the Indo-Pacific, and so you see now countries like UK, France, which France is kind of natural because it has territories in the Pacific, Germany, and the EU have Indo-Pacific strategies. Much of that has been at the invitation, please come, right? Please help us, because the center of geopolitics is now in the Indo-Pacific, and we need you. We want you to be part of that conversation. This is, of course, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's Japan. I mean, it is now a global power in all kinds of ways, and I haven't even talked about the global south and other kinds of ways that Japan engages with other parts of the world other than the Indo-Pacific. But Japan now sees itself as it's more necessary, I think, for most Japanese, for Japan to go out and advocate for the rules-based order, to be a champion in many ways of the rules-based order, as it comes under first criticism by China, Russia, and maybe Iran DPRK, but also as the United States starts to challenge whether this post-war order is really the best way forward for us, right? So global Japan, advocate Japan, very active partnerships with other countries around the world. Japan has really upped its game diplomatically and strategically.
Thank you. Just staying on the China point for a little bit, which always seems to be the elephant in the room. How would you describe Japan's strategy when managing that relationship?
Probably it is as challenging to Japan as it is to the rest of us. So, I mean, I'm going to be very I wrote a book about this, but I don't want to go on and on. So I'll just be very superficial in terms of the conclusion. Japan, for a long time, felt, in 78 onwards, felt that economic reconciliation could be achieved through economic integration. So, not economic reconciliation, historical reconciliation could be accomplished by economic integration, Japanese largesse, public and private, etc. And they strongly believe that this would be helping China develop its economy, would be the way in which they could best demonstrate their sorrow, their regret for the past. And the Chinese Communist Party seemed to, in the agreement and then subsequent years and speeches and visits, the emperor went, for example, in 92, which was a huge thing to have the Japanese emperor on Chinese soil. So the Chinese Communist Party leadership also embraced this, again, post-Deng and the years later, until we got to Jiang Zemin, who decided no thank you to that. But largely Chinese public policy was deepen the economic integration with Japan. Young Chinese love Japan. They travel to Japan all the time. If you go to Kyoto at any given moment during the high tourism season in Japan, you will be inundated with young Chinese visitors. So there is a popular conception also of Japan that's important to remember here, not just the state-to-state relationship. The challenge beyond the economic interdependence and other things, there's a territorial dispute which erupted in 2010 to 2012, which really put the two countries at loggerheads. There is obviously the rise in Chinese military power and the way in which the Chinese are using that military power to try, sorry, that's little guy, to sort of challenge their neighbors and in some ways push us out of what the Chinese refer to as the near seas, the East China Sea, the South China Sea. And of course, at the other side of those seas is Japan to the north and the Philippines to the south, both U.S. allies. So that has specific repercussions for Japanese security and defenses. China has also decided that it's not interested anymore in talking to Japan so much. It's really interested in talking to the United States. So for a while, I would say the second Obama administration, you really saw Japan-China diplomacy just fall off. And Chinese diplomats would actually say, Japan, you're just not important enough to us. Basically implying that they were a vassal of the United States anyway, and that really the strategic dialogue should be with Washington, and Japan is really unimportant. Now, some of that came from the territorial dispute and the spillover, but I think it's important to recognize that China has picked up the ball again in its diplomacy towards Japan. It is, as it has to other neighbors as well, including many of our allies. And you're seeing now a fairly renewed Chinese warmth, diplomatic warmth towards Japan, that the Japanese are feeling that they need to respond to, but with some caution. And so when Japan looks outwards, right, it's got friends in Southeast Asia, it's got Australia, Korea, sometimes. It's got other friends in the region who are also U.S. allies, but it's now looking with a far more aggressive China. And it's also looking at a United States that's beginning to question its role and its alliance, the credibility of the alliance or the reliability of the alliances. So for Japan, China is not separate from us, in terms of its own strategy. You will not see a Japan-China strategy that does not take into consideration what's happening in Washington. But you will see an economic strategy, economic emphasis in the relationship with China because it's so vitally important to Japanese private sector interests.
Well, it's interesting, too, because there was the the social media post from, I believe it was Chinese state media after the announcement of the tariffs that was promoting this idea that Japan and South Korea and China would be, banding together in, against these tariffs, which was China's position. And so it seems like China's chasing after this relationship, whereas Japan is almost trying to figure out how they can solidify this rules-based order. How do you characterize all of this?
So there is a trilateral that was initiated in 2008, and it's been sporadic in implementation, and meetings happen or don't happen depending on the Chinese, whether they decide to show up or they don't decide to show up. And it had been interrupted. So this is the ROK Japan trilateral. And I think a lot of people see this has been resuscitated a bit because China now feels like it wants to participate again. It was interrupted during the pandemic, and then it was interrupted when the Japanese had their territorial dispute. So it's been erratic, right, in terms of meetings. It's not the president of China who attends, it's the premier. And the ambition for this trilat was really because Korea and Japan and China had so much overlap among their publics, economic overlap. The idea was to talk about the economy. And eventually, if possible, to have a free trade agreement back when those were the thing that you wanted to accomplish, right? And today, so they had a meeting in March. The foreign ministers met in March. There's going to be a leaders meeting later this year. And that leaders meeting is expected. They rotate in hosting, right? And it's expected to be in Japan. So Premier Lee will be going to Japan for this meeting, as will whoever gets elected as the new president of South Korea. So this is on the cards for later this year, should the politics in Seoul make it possible. But at the latest foreign ministers meeting, which was March 25th, I think a lot of media, global media in particular, thought this was about Trump tariffs, or this was about reaction to the United States. So there was a little bit of a mood about it. And they do talk about economic relations and deepening economic ties. So of course, the big vibe, so to speak, is on the economic side, not strategic side. And yes, the Chinese have played this card quite nicely. In that post that you referenced, I had to go. We talked yesterday. I was like, "What post? What are you talking about? Whose post?" So I thought, it's going to be, somebody in Japan or South Korea, but it wasn't. It was Weibo, and it was the Chinese government basically setting expectations high. And I think this is kind of the rhetoric, and this is the way in which there's an opening now for China to say we're not the ones breaking the rules. The United States is, and we support the rules-based order. The United States doesn't. So there is an opening here, and the Chinese are using it ferociously. And that was one of I think of the outcomes after that meeting. And very quickly, the minister, who is the Minister of Economic Trade and Industry, who attended that meeting, put the damper on. That's not what we talked about. Absolutely not in our interest. Thank you very much. And so did the Korean attendee. So stay tuned and be aware of Chinese efforts to make.
Yes. Well, it was interesting because I first heard about it, as I was telling Sheila, from reputable experts, right? And so it just goes to show how quickly these ideas can get into social media and then into the mainstream. I'd like to just ask one or two more questions before I open it up to the audience. And one is, I'm curious just to get your take on North Korea, its growing nuclear capabilities. That's obviously a security concern for the world, but I think in particular for Japan. And how has Japan's approach to deterrence changed in recent years? And where do you see political will falling right now?
So two pieces of that question. So the North Korea, just so that you know, North Korea has always been or the Korean Peninsula, to be more accurate, has always been central to Japanese thinking about how a conflict might erupt in its neighborhood. And this is a Cold War origin story, right? And remember, Japan was there. The Korean War was right as Japan was beginning to negotiate the end of the occupation, right, after World War II. So, occupation lasted until 52, the San Francisco Peace Treaty then was implemented, and the Korean War was ended with a ceasefire in 53. The Armistice Agreement is 53. So just to get that little foundational piece. But the Japanese military, the self-defense forces, when they were created in 54, had to reorganize themselves, right? They had to start fresh. And you don't really get any serious insights into Japanese defense planning, like what kind of scenarios might the Japanese self-defense force have to defend Japan until mid-60s or so. And this is in the context of the treaty with South Korea that I mentioned earlier. This gets leaked right out into the Diet debate. And basically the Korean contingency was the primary organizing principle under which the Japanese thought they may have to think about their defenses. And they were always seen as being the backup crowd for the Americans who would be in the combat role on the Korean Peninsula. Japan was never talking about itself fighting in the Korean War or anything that might erupt. So they were logistical support, supply support. They were the back end of whatever might happen on the Korean Peninsula. That didn't change with North Korea's announcement in the 90s that it was going to pursue a nuclear arsenal and that it was going to develop the missile capability to deliver that arsenal. And of course, the North Koreans could never really threaten Japan up until the point in 1998 when they launched the Tepodon missile. Some of you may remember that. Kaze. Sorry, that's the North Korean backstory there. But all of a sudden, the Japanese public said, oh my gosh, they've got missiles. And the Tepodon went over Japan in 1998. That was a very successful first test of that intermediate range ballistic missile. So Japanese public was alerted to the fact that they were vulnerable. The Japanese government then had to address this vulnerability publicly. And so you start to see this slow sort of acknowledgement that Japan was going to be vulnerable, not only to the ballistic missiles, but to the nuclear weapons that North Korea may eventually develop to put on those, right? So every time you see 2017, there was a mass of testing. You probably remember that if you were paying attention the first Trump administration. President Trump went to the United Nations and said fire and fury, and Kim Jong-un was shooting rhetoric at the United States. So there was a very tense several months there when it wasn't all that clear whether or not there was actually going to be an exchange of military kinetic, as they say in the Pentagon, forces between the United States and Japan. Japan was petrified. I mean, the Japanese were petrified because whatever would happen over top of them. The Japanese government has responded up until 2022 with the idea that ballistic missile defenses would be sufficient. And that would be integrated also into American regional military defenses. So ballistic missile defenses was the Japanese sort of Ministry of Defense's official response to that mission. And then in 2022, to shift into your second question, Courtney, about where the Japanese are today, they announced that they were revamping their military planning to accelerate acquisition of certain capabilities, but also to ensure that the Japanese self-defense forces would be more prepared and ready, given the rising military tensions in the region. So two things are important about 2022. We can talk a lot more about the details of what's in motion at the moment. But this is the initial 5 years of this. We are currently coming up on the end of the first 5 years. 2027 would be the end of this first initial defense plan. But Prime Minister Kishida, who oversaw this strategic review, announced that Japan would commit 2% of GDP to its military and strategic investments. And also that Japan would acquire conventional strike capability. So if you're not a nerdy military person, which I'm assuming most of you probably aren't, but that means that they would get a missile that would be capable of reaching out and touching not only the North Koreans, but also reaching out and touching the Chinese. Now, conventional means non-nuclear. And so basically the initial step of this would be to purchase from the United States Tomahawk cruise missiles. But alongside that is a development initiative for Japan to develop its own longer range ballistic missiles. So you have a significant investment announced given the military balance and the change in the military balance in Northeast Asia, where the Japanese feel they're playing catch up, really, not only to North Korea, but to China. And second, you've got this very specific strike capability announcement that is designed, to allow the Japanese to have options should the Chinese or anybody else test them. But it changes the game for the U.S. Japan Alliance just a little bit as well. Because up until then, our forces were the strategic forces that would be allowed and able to do offensive missions in the region. Japan only had defensive capabilities, and they were organized defensively. They were not organized for offensive military action. So pretty striking moment of transformation for Japan and its military.
All right. On that note,
thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.